Hey there guys, and welcome back. So here we are in the GitHub. Session 37 is in the books. As you can see, we banged this out in one weekend, 18th and the 19th. I will say Saturday. That's what day that was, that's Saturday. Frankly, very not focused on Saturday for whatever reason, and possibly for many reasons. Just plain very unfocused. So even though we've got that's 2 hours there, and then I guess that's 3 hours 45, something like that, right there. So that would be nearly 6 hours on Saturday. Probably only got 3 hours worth of work actually done, especially because I was watching a stream for an hour while I was working over here, and while that did not slow me down much, combined with everything else, it was probably 2 hours slower than I would have been on Saturday. However, Sunday was definitely very productive. Very happy with how quickly I was working on Sunday. So, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and hop into the demo to see where we're at. And then we can hop back over here and I will go over some of the code changes in GitHub before going to VS Code. So, here we are on the main page. I'll go ahead and load up my most recent save file. And everything looks as you would expect it. You should be familiar with this screen so far. Nothing new there, but we do have this depart button. I will probably be formatting this button differently in the future, but for the time being, it's just right here at the top for utilitarian sake. Now, first thing I will note is that if we hit this, and actually this isn't a demo, I called it a demo just a minute ago, but this is the actual game at this point. So if we try to leave without anything in our inventory, as you can see here, we get this message. It says exploring space is naturally dangerous, yada yada yada. Make sure you have repair bots. So in case you forgot, because it has been a while, one of our mechanics in this game is that you use repair bots while traveling. And we're doing that instead of food. In the previous game in a dark room, you used food while traveling. We're using repair bots in our case. And instead of just dying when you run out of repair bots, you take damage. You lose HP when you're moving without repair bots. So just for new players, technically speaking, we could let them get away with it and they just die within a few steps, leaving without repair bots. But for new players, we got this message in here. Just make sure everything's above board and they know they need repair bots to travel. So I'll clear this out. Oh, actually, I will bring that back up. Also, this isn't an encounter. We did not have encounters formally implemented in the game. That is something that happened here. So this is one of our encounter screens, in case you do not recognize it, that we had in the map demo. And that is now implemented into the game, handling encounters. So anyway, as I was saying, we're going to go ahead and toss some repair bots in here. And just for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and load us up with some more stuff. And I'll go ahead and take this. We're at 92 scrap, so keep that number in mind. I'm going to go ahead and just take 5 of it, just for the sake of the argument. And then we will go ahead and depart. So now we have the map screen. As you can see, we got all these little dots, which just mean empty spaces. We'll talk about map generation in a minute when we get over to the code. Actually, it'll be a couple minutes, but we'll get there eventually. However, as you can see, I can travel around, and now I've got this icon over here, and I'll just travel around a little more. As you can see, I'm about to die. There we go. So here we go. Here's one of your death messages, one of your game over messages. And this one's specifically for running out of HP while traveling. Again, we'll show that in the code, how that gets determined. Otherwise, you get the game over screen and it kicks you all the way back out. So we'll hop back into the game. I'll get myself set back up as before, and this time we will not die. So let's get ourselves kitted up. Again, for demonstration purposes, I'm going to put this stuff into the cargo. And this time, let's just take a quick jaunt around. So we take a quick jaunt around, we get back to the colony, and it automatically loads us back into the colony screen, gets rid of the map. We got this thing saying that, dock workers unload your resources. You may recall this from the demo as well. This time, our resources actually went back into the colony, though, as you can see here. So that scrap, the reason I took it was you can see it goes back up to 92. but our kinetic slugs, because that is equipment ammunition, that stayed at 5. We did not lose any of our ammunition, only the resources that we do not need, i.e. scrap, went back into the colony. Meanwhile, we have 0 repair bots here because we used them all up to get back. It's 1 repair bot every 2 spaces. We walked 4 spaces, so that's 2 repair bots. So we'll go ahead and buy a few more of these. And I just want, actually, you know what? I'm going to buy a bunch more of those. Just because I want to make sure that the last thing we need to demonstrate here, since we got everything else, actually there's 2 more things, I guess, to demonstrate. But we're almost done. As you can see here, I did not fix this. I know I said I was going to fix this. It's actually, for whatever reason, a little difficult for me to track down what exactly is causing the NAN. I thought I fixed it at first, which is why I let it go. And then I realized that it popped up later. I could not replicate it, so one of these deals where we'll figure it out eventually. That is, however, still on the list to get fixed. But point being is, I wanted to at least travel over to the edge of the page so that we can see that I cannot travel off the edge. That's good, and also we can also see that the vision is working as expected. So I'm not somehow getting vision out here. The vision stops if you're watching as we got closer. And I am, all right, we have 1 more reactor power left, so there's 0. And if we try to take another step, here's the last thing we wanted to demonstrate for this version of the game. There is one of our other game over screens. And this is, again, because we ran out of reactor fuel. And there's a game over and back to the main menu. So that is the entirety of the game so far. That was the entirety of the session 37 update, which was, first off, getting a map, randomly generating a map. And then after that, getting the map implemented into the game, pulling what code we needed from the demo and adapting it where necessary. And then also handling a couple other edge cases, which we will go over, like I said. So let's hop over to GitHub, because the changes in GitHub, there's a few that we can go over that are very simple. We don't need VS Code for, and it's just quicker to do through GitHub. And then we'll hop into VS Code for the more substantial changes. All right, here we are over in GitHub, and easy changes. Added some more text to the English.json. So this is obviously UI text. Up here in the CSS files, added CSS file stuff. As always, I don't bother going through CSS because it's just one of those things. It does what it does, and I'm not going to bother explaining it. There's nothing really to explain. It has to look a certain way, and you know, exactly how it looks is exactly how it's going to end up being coded. So nothing too interesting to say there. Down here in map, a few small things before we get to the bigger things in VS Code. So right here, unexplored port symbol, we just added symbol onto the end here so that it matched all our other symbols, right? That's just a clerical thing to keep everything in line. We added in the empty symbol. We did not have the empty symbol before. We just were using white space. But I believe in a darkroom, if I recall correctly, there was no white spaces because white space is the mask. So your vision mask is white space. Therefore, you need a symbol to show that something is not just masked off, it is actually empty. Coming down here, we added a couple more events. Those are obviously the no fuel and no repair, and that's what triggered our game over events. Down here, we added game to the map constructor because the map ended up needing a reference back to game. We did not have that before. We now have that. So that fixes that problem. Also UI. We didn't have a UI associated with the map before. Now we do. So we can go ahead and add that. I'm going to skip over create map because, again, that is a large section of code that we'll go over in VS Code specifically. Clear loop, we have a map loop that handles events, handles player movements and whatnot. So we never had a clear function for that. We added in a clear function for that. For example, when you get a game over or when the player loads up a new game, etc., etc., etc. So we now have that clear loop function. And then this code right here, very simply, is the thing that sets off the no fuel, as you can see right here, event. So it just checks to make sure you have reactor power. If you don't, then it just signals to anything that listening that you did not have the reactor power to make this movement. And similarly down here, we do the same exact thing with a repair bot quantity. Here's the no repair, so obviously we need to get the repair items before we monitor the repair bots. I changed how we handled the inventory change right here, just made it a little bit cleaner and a little bit more straightforward. And also changed the item removed actual event right here. As you can see, we have the item and the index now. Instead of items changed, we're using item removed. This may or may not be correct. My idea here is that when we took things in and out of inventory, we're using item removed and item add. So it makes sense that changing quantity would also be an item remove, as opposed to items changed. Items changed, I think we're going to just use for item state changes. So for example, for items have cooldowns. So that's the other thing that this was used for before. So when the cooldown state changed, that would trigger an items change. That's kind of overloading the event by having it do, this category of thing and then also handle quantity changes. So I changed this to just do item removed instead. All this red text down here, basically it's a little bit of silliness on GitHub, just because I put this space in here, right, and changed how this was written. You can go ahead and compare it for yourself. I changed exactly how this lines out. So basically, this was in one big if statement, all this code right here. And I went, well, that's kind of silly. Why did we do that? Instead of just checking to see if it's false and returning immediately and then handling everything outside of a loop. So that's all that is. I just got rid of a loop and instead used the negative case to return early. And I believe this is the similar thing down here with this. Down here in get map, all the way at the bottom, we did not have this catch for empty options, so I added a catch for empty options, which was necessary. And then this is just simply the symbol getting updated, right? Also, actually, that's another thing I missed. I totally missed at the top. We renamed dungeon symbol to planet symbol. Dungeon symbol was a holdover from us mimicking a dark room. We have established that dungeons are now called planets, so may as well keep everything in order. And then finally at the bottom down here, we just had a very minor error. I don't know exactly why this did not register on the demo, but basically this is the loop for checking the vision. And it was trying to see off the map and was raising an error. So all I had to do was just adjust this. Now, honestly, I put in the -1. The other way to do this would just make this equals right here. Either way would have worked. They do the same exact thing. Over in IO, we are now iterating over items and weapons when we save, because now items and weapons have slots that are significant. Previously, we were expecting the items and weapons bags to just be bags for things to just naturally float down the list so that we could always take them from the start of the list to the end of the list and we would have no empty slots. Well, we changed how we were handling that, and now you can have empty slots inside of your list. So we had to change how we're saving that in order for things to go back to the correct slots. And also this just plain broke because there were empty slots in it. And likewise down here, you'll see that in save data, we got to actually pull those back out. So up here, we're saving the index in each of these. So we need to pull the index back out and put that in the correct space. So that's all that stuff is. And then finally, we were not topping off the transport when we loaded it from save. So we need to do that. Again, transports are singletons within the program. So if I have a game and I hit new game, right? The transport on the game object itself is used for both of those games that are active. And the second use of game there that I'm saying out loud, that is the quote unquote gameplay. Okay, that's not the game object because the game object is the same, and that's why it uses the same transport. We are not recreating the transport every time the player gets it. We're just pulling it off of the game object. We could change that, but I didn't see a need to. So for that reason, we got to remember to top off the transport whenever possible. Otherwise, it ends up empty. Over here in the encounters and combat GUIs, what you'll see is that I added this get setup event box just in case. So when I first ran the code, I just, again, copy pasted from our demos. And I had not actually included the events or the combat box elements in the UI that was loaded when you loaded up a game. So I went ahead and added this code in and then adjusted everything to say get or set up. right? Get setup event box, get setup combat box, as you can see right here. I made that change, and then I went ahead and actually had those things generated by the UI when you hit new game or load game. So this is a little bit redundant and a little bit unnecessary at this point, but it's still a good catch just in case. And all it does is obviously checks for the event box, checks for the combat box over here. And if it's not there, then it just creates a new one. That's all that is. And then it returns the event box, and the calling function can go ahead and use the event box reference there. So that's a very simple change, a little bit unnecessary, but at the same time is a nice catch-all just in case something goes wrong. Over here in the colony GUI, previously I had talked about how we were using map here when it was really travel prep. I gave like a 35-hour long diatribe on, maybe I shouldn't name it that, but needless to say, as you can see, I went ahead and renamed everything from map to travel. So instead of being a map page, it's a travel page. And then down here, you can see travel page.add event listener instead of map page.add event listener. So just a whole bunch of changes like that. The other very minor change, even though it's a big block here, is that I put the colony inside of its own div. Previously, it was just sitting inside of the game window div. I moved it down a level. I just added another nested div in there. So that is pretty simple. If you're going through the changelog, you'll see this stuff right here, which I'm not mentioning right now because this is stuff we literally did during the last code review section. So that's literally already recorded, so I'm not going to bother mentioning it. This right here, previously for whatever reason I was using get item instead of get item index in order to get the index and then pass that to items added. I don't know what I was doing there. I don't know why I used get item instead of get index. So that was a little bit of a derp. I had a little bit of a bug with the arrows not being displayed correctly based on quantity for items and resources. So I added this line here. We are now passing in an availability thing here to properly modify the plus to be disabled if it's not available. And that obviously gets passed in down here, for example, inside of, I believe this is... Okay, I had to check because I couldn't actually remember. This is update loadout. And point being is you'll see this a couple other places. I also missed an update map weight, which is one of the reasons why I thought the map weight was off. And if you recall, when I was demoing last episode, we got rid of an item. I think it was a weapon, and it did not update. That's because I had missed this update map right here. Keep this in mind right here, how this get resources now dot quantity. We'll go over that when we get over to player. I reorganized this a little bit inside of update mech resources, and when we check for the element, we're actually going to check for the parent, which is the one that actually has the ID, instead of going all the way down to the quantity span. And the reason for that is so that we can use this .add quantity down here. That way we can reuse some of our code. That's a very simple change, very minor. And we'll go over this when we get over to VS Code. Otherwise, we will move on to the next file. Over in game, very simple. I mentioned that the map and the player both got the game reference at this point. So that's all this is right here. And then there's the clear loop I was talking about. And there's the player gets a reference to the game as well. So you're familiar with that. Over in encounters, I just made a very simple build message sequence. We had build combat encounter before. I figured having these utility functions is useful. So all this is it takes a series of messages and then composes them into an encounter sequence. I won't go over the code. We've been over how encounters are created before, so I will refer you back to that conversation. Just obviously creates a whole bunch of message encounters and returns a sequence. This right here is important. This is get item right here. And previously, if we did not find the item or it had quantity 0, we were automatically returning null. I made sure we fixed that. So there were situations in which it was not returning the instance for the item if it did not find it. But obviously with the return empty thing, if return empty is true, then we want to actually create that instance. And this is probably why we weren't doing it before, because there was no instance on our player, so we didn't have anything to return. But now with this .game, now that we gave player a reference to this .game, now the player can use the create equipment instance itself in order to create instances. So now that we can do that, this function now acts correctly, quote unquote. It acts the way it really should have been working from the beginning and always returns an item if return empty is true. Similarly, down here in get resources, because the resources are always quantities, we never returned the resource instance itself. Now we can. So now we can return the resource instance itself, so you get the resource instance back. You'll recall a couple files ago, I said, actually, I think it was over in the colony. So I guess that was a couple files ago, but the colony GUI, I said, notice how we have resource.quantity now. This is why, because we changed get resource. Now that we have reference to the game to be able to create the resource object itself and return that. In add item, as you can see from this note previously, we couldn't distinguish, and this is something I touched on just a second ago, between zero quantity and undefined, which is the item does not exist. So back here at get item, previously we were only returning null for whether or not the item existed or not. So that's the same deal here. We're rearranging this so that we can make sure that we always return the object instance. And because we made the change to get resource so that the get resource actually returned an object instead of an instance, we had to modify this. So that's all that is right there. And that is all of the minor updates. So now we will go into the more significant updates over in VS Code. All right, I want to go ahead and get check show map out of the way in the colony GUI, just because it's simple and straightforward and a minor update, relatively speaking, to all the other massive updates that we're about to cover here in VS Code. So this is the callback for the depart button. It checks the repair bots, as you can see here, and return true right here, so return empty, so we always have repair bots.quantity available, and we don't have to check, for example, not repair bots, type of repair bots does not equal undefined, etc. So instead of typing all that, now we can just go ahead and just have not repair bots. So that is simple enough right there. Then we go ahead and get our strings to format this build message. So if we do not have repair bots, as you saw when I was playing through the game, it gave us that message. That message needs to be formatted. So we go ahead and get the strings in order to format the message. We go ahead and I'm going to come back to this in just a second. The message we're formatting is right here. This is this.translate strings travel repair. So if you'll recall our translate and how that works, that gets the travel repair string from the JSON, and then this is the substitution dictionary. So it will substitute the repair bots tag for repair bot string.name, transport name, etc. And now that is that build message sequence I had mentioned before. So this list of messages, which is only just one message, gets passed into that. It passes back a sequence, and then we add that to our game. We use get or add encounter sequence. That way it is tagged onto the end of the game just in case there's a race condition, tagged onto the end of the game encounters list just in case there's a race condition where the gameplay loop generates a random encounter for us to deal with. This one doesn't get lost and this one doesn't replace that random encounter. So the random encounter will happen first or second, and then this will happen first or second, depending on how that race condition gets resolved, and we'll be fine. Otherwise, if we have repair bots, so we don't go into this loop, then we can just go ahead and show map. Very simple. Game, map, UI, show map. Done. Easy. All right, now working our way up in complexity, we are now over in the game GUI file, and we added in the game over messages right here as strings. And then you needed the keyboard in order to move around the map. Now I could import key bindings all over the place. The problem is that the key bindings file, and let me go ahead and open it up really quick. But as you'll see, the key binding file actually refers to things in order to get constants out of those files. For example, these are the directions enumerations out of the map file. So that would create a circular import problem. So instead of dealing with that, I went ahead and bound key bindings to the game GUI, and then anybody that needs access to key bindings, so for example, the map for its event listeners, that can go ahead and just reference this .game.ui.keybindings in order to look things up. Next up, and I mentioned this briefly earlier when we were talking about combat and event windows, I added these in here so that whenever it creates the game window, it automatically creates those two. Again, these should never disappear, so the get or add encounter, for example, should never actually have to create it, but just in case, it's good that it's still there. And then we added listeners to the game UI because the game UI did not have listeners. As you can see right here, it does not have any listeners. It was setting up previously. It now has listeners because now it needs to listen for encounters. So this whole entire block right here was copy pasted out of the map demo with just minor alterations to make things easier. We may come back and modify these calls right here. I'll have to look at it because the map demo was very streamlined and very simple. So we may want a little bit more control in here. We may want to pass these off to an intermediary function, but for the time being, they're working just fine as they were in the map demo for all of these encounter listeners. And then these are the game over listeners right here. So this, obviously checks the HP change, and this is for when your HP runs out. This is the no repair one. This is the no fuel one. No fuel is a game over. No repair actually is not a game over. This is actually a damage to player. So this is on the game UI instead of the gameplay, because our idea with the gameplay object was that was all unlocks. So if I hop over here to that, we made this note at the very top. Whoop, I did not open it evidently. We made this note right here. A class to implement gameplay unlock upgrades, tree sequences. So I decided not to add the game mechanics themselves to the gameplay sequence. The gameplay sequence instead is only stuff that kind of, I'm going to say, progresses the story. They're not core mechanics. They're optional / story mechanics. And therefore, they're a separate object. So instead, for core game mechanics, those will lie on the game UI. And the game UI will go ahead and handle stuff like that. Stuff that is not otherwise delegated, for example, to the map. The map is responsible for reducing fuel, so that's a core game mechanic that is not responsible for combat. Combat is responsible for handling weapon damage and item damage, etc., etc., etc. So the game UI is also not responsible for that. However, the game UI will be responsible if your player dies in combat for bringing up the game over screen for that. We haven't implemented combat just yet in the main game. We only have that in the demos, but when that happens, we'll go ahead and add that to check HP. That will check if a combat is in place and then go ahead and provide you with a message that you died in combat. Right here is a generic game over function, so anything can call the game over function with a message to display. It will go ahead and add that message plus the game over screen to that message sequence. That way it gives you your death message and then shows the game over screen. Adds that encounter on there, and as you can see, we are setting that encounter directly to the sequence, so this will overwrite any other sequence that is going on right now. It will clear those sequences out and immediately put you in the game over state. And actually, I kind of glossed over this one, but we add to the message sequences that we built. At the very end, this is a callback for us to exit the main menu. So this will exit the game and bring us back to main menu. You saw that happen twice while I was playing through the game earlier. Fuel is very simple. This is the no fuel callback. So when the map raises the no fuel event, it immediately comes to here. We already know that the player has run out of fuel. There is no second chances. If you run out of fuel, you're just dead. So we just automatically set the game over and translate this fuel game over. Easy enough. Check repair likewise. This is when you do not have repair bots and you're moving and it requires a new repair bot. This automatically just reduces the player's HP. It doesn't need to check if the player died because that will be a separate event raised that the game UI can listen for. So that's not something it needs to check right now. It will get the message after it reduces HP. Adjust HP, I should say, automatically raises the player HP change. That works a little bit differently than, for example, adding and removing items, weapons, etc. Those things do not automatically raise the event. We may want to change that in future. We may not. I'm not 100% sure. Right now, I can't think of any reason why we need to. with items, weapons, and resource change, with equipment change, I should say more generally, whether you're adding or removing them, the reason not to automatically raise that event is because you may want to move a lot of items or resources at once. So rather than raising 10 resource changes as you change 10 different resources, you'll only want to raise one resource change event and then just list all the resources that were changed in that event. Down here in check HP checks whether or not the player is dead. So if the player is at 0 HP, this will be false right here, which means that we will not immediately return. So long as the player has any HP, it will return immediately. Otherwise, we need to figure out what you died for. And this will again be expanded, for example, for combat. As I stated earlier, we'll add a line in here checking to see if combat is currently on the screen. If it is and you reduce to 0, then we know exactly how you died. You died in combat. And we'll add the game over with the translation for combat game over. Easy enough. We also have this default message right here just in case we do not figure out what exactly killed you. We at least have a message, a generic message that leaves it a bit open-ended. You'll find that out as you play the game. And then down here, because we added the initialize listeners, we have to actually call it. So we added these lines down here, initialize and initialize, easy enough. And also the map move loop. Now that we have the map implemented, now we have to add the move loop, get that started in order for it to start polling for new events, new player movement events. And with that done, we can now move over to the actual map script. And this would be the generate map is what we're on now, create map. So this is a brand new function that we created. We had not randomly generated the map before. There is still work I'd like to do on this because right now we do not have terrain. So we've created the map. We created an algorithm to create a completely randomized map, which right here, I'm going to go ahead and leave you to read through all this right here to understand why we're doing completely randomized and what problems arise with a completely randomized map. And basically my write-off on why we're going to experiment with this for right now. I had considered doing a pseudo-random map where things were distributed in a controlled manner, still randomly, but in a controlled manner. And I decided to go ahead and try this with complete randomization first. The idea being is that in theory, I would like this to be a bit of a roguelite. That was the idea when we started this. And therefore replayability would be at its highest if things were completely randomized. Yes, it could result in much higher difficulty spikes, or it could make the game a lot more difficult because you're a bit underpowered as you explore the nearby area. And therefore, as you get further out, you don't get as many higher tier upgrades. I think those things are alright for right now. We'll see whether or not that actually pans out. But for the time being, we're going to experiment and see exactly how well that works. Otherwise, we go ahead and initialize an empty map right here. This is just all empty values, as you can see right here. So it fills the map with empty values. We go ahead and get a new random based on our seed. As you can see, this is new seed random with our seed. So this seed random will always generate the same exact map every single time for the given seed. So when we load back out of the save file, we will recreate the map. The map is not saved to the save file, so we need to recreate that map, and this will always make sure that we generate the same exact map so long as this algorithm never changes. If this algorithm changes, then you can no longer generate that previous map. There's an option here that we could change this to, for example, deprecated create map, and then on the save file, we can add a map version. So you can use older versions of the map algorithm using old save files, because the old save file will have a version attached to it, and therefore the program, when it goes to create the map right here, can check the save version, and if the save version is X, use X algorithm. So that's something we can implement in the future if we decide we need to change this algorithm in order to make save files backwards compatible. Or I guess forwards compatible is the more accurate way of saying that. Your old save files forwards compatible, the current program backwards compatible. Here you can see we have 5 planets. You're always going to have 5 planets, 5 dungeons to play through in a game session. Again, depending on how quickly this gameplay goes through. We'll see what happens with that. Again, it's still a little bit up in the air on how exactly all this works out and the rate of gameplay. But for the time being, always 5 planets, so always 5 dungeons that I'm assuming are going to give you more powerful upgrades. I'm assuming that's why we're putting dungeons into this game. And then you have a random number of stations. These are the cities from a dark room. These will give you stuff, but will not give you game-defining upgrades, unlike the planets. And then these unexplored are the houses from a dark room. So these are just little posts where you can refuel and collect a couple minor resources to keep you traveling, to enable you to travel further into the map with limited supplies on your ship. And this is again a random number. Again, note that all these random numbers will be exactly identical each and every single time because we are using a seeded random. Remaining structures, so basically the way I decided to do this, because we're doing a completely randomized map, literally all we have to do is just take all our structures that we have and just assign them to something, okay? And so the way I'm doing this, if you read through again this description up here, is we have this map. It's 21 by 21 squares wide, and we can divide that into 49 sectors. So 49 3x3 chunks, okay? Kind of like in Minecraft, how you have chunks of the map. Well, we can divide our thing into chunks, and then we just need to, for each chunk, or I should say for each of these structures, assign it to a random chunk. We always are guaranteed to have less than 49 chunks. Sectors, I should probably stop saying chunks. I should just call them sectors. But we always have fewer structures than we have sectors, and therefore we know that we're never going to run out of sectors to assign planets, stations, etc. structures to. So with that being said, as I said, we have this list of structures. We grab a random sector, pull the sector out of the list. First though, we got to make sure that it's not the home sector. The home sector is where the colony is. We don't want to put a structure right next to the colony. If it's 2 squares away, all right, you got lucky, you got a structure 2 squares away from the colony. Again, if we wanted to control for that, we could with a more complicated algorithm, but for right now, it's completely random. If you get one that close, good on you, you got lucky. Maybe, maybe not. It depends on what exactly it is and whether or not you need the upgrades. For example, if it's a nearby planet, well, that planet's going to be very easy to clear out as a low level character, quote unquote low level, because we don't actually have levels, but a character with fewer upgrades at any rate. However, it will not give you as good of a reward. So there's the trade-off there. Again, I'm beating a little bit of a dead horse there, but point being is that you can never put a structure in the home sector. But since we're already on the home sector, we go ahead and replace the dot that is right there with the colony symbol. And then we can go ahead and go on to the next sector. So that will obviously loop back up to here. We'll pull another sector out, and this time after we get the home sector done, we'll know for a fact that is one you can add a structure to, and therefore we are good to pull a structure out of the remaining structures. And then we just got to determine where to put that inside of that 3x3. I'm going to say it one last time, chunk, 3x3 sector. You have 9 squares, randomly generate a square within those 9 squares to put it in. Pretty simple right there. I'll refer you to these notes if you have trouble understanding why the math is the way the math it is. Otherwise, here you go. Here's your Y, here's your X, and put the structure there. Just replace that character with the structure. And then because we store each of our rows as a string, we just need to iterate back through and join each of the rows as its own string. And then we're done because it gets saved to this.map, so there's nothing else to do. And with that being said, we now just have the map GUI file. This file was brand new this session, completely from scratch. Everything in here is new. So let's get into it. So obviously at the top here we have strings. Again, this is UI stuff, so we'll ignore that for the time being. It's just stuff that goes into make translation and this.translate. So easy peasy. Obviously, it's a UI for the map, so it gets referenced back to the map. We have a couple of references here, for example, to the game, to the map box, which is the div that's holding the map, and then to the map itself. Very simple. We set up the map right here. Doesn't need much explanation. We have the HP, reactor power, and repair bots at the top, and then the map underneath. after we set up the map, we need to update the map to make sure that it's actually displaying what we need. For example, it's displaying the correct vision range, the correct dots, etc, etc, etc. So that gets updated. And then we attach our listeners for things that we need to update on the screen. So this updates HP and supplies, as you can say, for all these different things. We just have one function handling all those different things because, frankly, they're all in the same box. So that's why I figured we'd just have one function. These could be broken up into 3 different functions. So this add removed would be one function. This equipment change would be one function. This is the fuel changing right here specifically. And then this would be the third one, which would be HP change and current HP change, which would modify the current HP and the max HP right here. We could break those up into 3, but because they're all inside the same box, I just decided to make them the same exact function. Next up, after the player has moved, we need to update the map. That will include updating the vision, so easy enough. And then we got the key press right here, which again we talked about earlier with key bindings, the key bindings file. So this will call our this.move. Again, this is ours, not the map's. And then that will decide whether or not it's a correct key binding, as you'll see in a minute, and then pass it off to the... Actually, it doesn't pass it off. It adds to the queue, the player queue on the map. Again, we'll look at that in just a second. And then we have the enter colony thing here, which unloads us and minimizes the map. It minimizes the map, unloads us, does a couple other things. And then right here, because we're setting up the UI, again, we're still in setup UI, we make sure that the player is at the home square, because whenever you load a game, the player is always started in the colony. The player cannot save outside of the colony, which is actually not something I implemented yet, but we will do that in the future. We'll make sure that the player cannot save while he's traveling on the road. You can only save in the colony, and if you can only save in the colony, that means that you should always be at the colony when you load back in. I just realized that this is an extra one. I forgot that I had done this up here. This update map should be good enough for all this. So that will get deleted at some point. Actually, we'll probably delete this one just for the heck of it. Here, I'll do that right now, live on stream. There we go, it's gone. So now we only have one update map. That was a little bit silly of me. And then these update HP supplies, again, just to make sure that this box right here is filled in correctly when we start the game. All right, here's that update map function that we were talking about. It takes an event, but it doesn't really need the event because it doesn't really do anything with the event. It just sets the vision, makes sure the vision is updated for the player, and then gets the map string and loads it into the GUI. Easy peasy. Here's the update HP supplies handler that we were talking about before. Again, this is going to do basically 3 different things. There's technically 4 things because you update different things based on HP, but we have the equipment change, which is the fuel, updates the fuel as you can see right here. We have the current HP change right here, and then the HP change, which is the max HP change right here. Again, those in theory could be one function together, split like this, or they could be, in this whole entire thing, doesn't really matter. And then we have the item add removed, which we check whether or not the repair bots have changed. That's right here. So checks event item type ID to be 0 because 0 is repair bots. If that is correct, then we need to update repair bots on the screen. And that's everything in here. Pretty straightforward. I'm going to skip show map for just a second because that's something that happens over in the colony. And we're going to go ahead and cover our things first. So here in move, we have this.map lock. So this move again is the callback for the key bindings. If you hit the keyboard while the map is locked because we are either in a colony, in combat, on a planet, or on a station. We're doing something. We're doing something other than doing map stuff. That is why the map is locked. Therefore, keyboard events for the map do not get processed. Since they do not get processed, we return immediately. Is understandable. Otherwise, we translate the event key through our key bindings key directions to check if it's a direction. If it's not a direction, then we can go ahead and return. That's the only thing we're handling right now. We don't have an items menu to go through. We don't have any other sub menus for map travel. The only thing you do on the map is move around. And then, as I mentioned, we go ahead and add our map action to the player queue. So one of those things, just grab a map action type out of that thing. Again, we went into depth on what exactly this is and how this works back when we implemented in the map demo. So look up the map demo and you can find out more about that if you need to, or otherwise look at the source code. Again, source code is always available up on the GitHub. Feel free to read it through anything you don't understand. Pass in the directions, and now that is on the maps player queue, which means that when it pulls for player actions, it will handle it at that point. And if we actually use that key, we prevent it from doing anything else. So if there's another thing listening for the keyboard after us, we'll stop that from happening. We'll stop that event from handling whatever it is it's doing. And actually, before we come into enter colony, I actually will come back up here to show map, just because we do the reverse of this down here. So it makes sense to get the one direction in first. So again, this is called by the colony after it decides that you have repair bots and therefore can travel out of the colony. First off, we make sure that the player is home. This in theory should never be a problem, because when we set up the game, it automatically moved the player home, and the player can't move away from the colony unless it's showing the map. So in theory, this should be extraneous, but just to be safe, we go ahead and do this. Similarly with update map, this shouldn't really be that big of a deal. It probably is not going to change anything. The only thing this could possibly change is random events. If a random event changes your vision on the map, then that could possibly change what the map looks like, and therefore we need to update it. However, the random event itself should probably call update map on its own. But, you know, one of those things, just in case we forget to do that, we call update map here. And then, as you can see right here, we remove hidden, do shown. Again, this is from the map demo. It's a pop-up. Pop-ups are pop-up CSS class. If it is shown, it's one thing. If it's hidden, it's another thing. Again, went over that at that point. And now that we are on the map, we can remove the map lock. So map lock is false here. And with that out of the way, we can go down to enter colony. So this is when you move back onto the colony square, when you're traveling around the map and move back to the colony square. First thing, very first thing, make sure the map is locked. Don't want anything else happening at this point. You have entered the colony. You are now done. Stop moving. Next up, we have this dropped resources function. Now, this is mostly copied out of the map demo. That would be everything up to, I want to say, let's see. Yeah, I think it might even be up to here. So if it wasn't up to here, then it was everything between here and here was in the map demo. Basically decides what you're allowed to keep, which is the ammunition out of your resources, and then goes over the resources. If it's in the keep pile, does not remove it. Otherwise, as you can see, we get the resource from the player. If it doesn't have a quantity, then, you know, there's no reason for us to even touch it. Otherwise, it comes down here, gets the quantity itself, puts it into this resources box right here, which is what we're going to use later on to trigger resources modified. Deletes it off the player, so the player no longer has it, and then adds it to the colony. Because again, any resources that you bring home go to the colony. If you want to take them back out of the colony, you can, but resources, generally speaking, unless they're ammunition, are not useful to the player. So they're only useful for the colony. Again, unless they're ammunition. And then, as I mentioned, we do resources modified here with the resource change right there for the colony. Get that event up so the colony can update its GUI. And then we just need to flip this list around. So again, remember, we were taking the quantity and putting it into the resources object. So that quantity is going to naturally be a positive amount. But when the player loses that quantity and calls its resources changed callback event, well, that quantity is actually a negative for the player. From the player's perspective, he lost quantity. So we just need to flip that around really quick and then call trigger event, and we're good. So again, just to recap really quick, that was all inside of drop resources. All of that was inside of drop resources. So with that function out of the way, that's the callback we're using. We go ahead and compose a message letting the player know that he has returned to base. I have two different messages based on whether or not you have meeples at your colony. If you happen to be a loner who never had any meeples, then you get a different message, but that is what it is. So obviously we go ahead and translate that message in population this is whatever message we have here between these two, and then population we just get from the UI, get descriptor, we've used that before. Create a new callback encounter. A callback encounter, in case you do not recall, has a message and then also has a function it calls. So this is where drop resources get called. So when it does the message, then it calls drop resources afterwards. We add that to the game. Again, we're adding, that way we're not accidentally replacing any encounter that's already on the stack. There's no reason to replace it. It can happen before or after, it doesn't necessarily matter. And then, like I said, this is the inverse of what we're doing on the show map. So we are instead removing shown and doing hidden. And that is everything. We have completed all the stuff that we need to go over for this session. I'm scrolling around and I don't think there's anything that we need, and looking at the GitHub, pretty sure we covered everything. And yep, that is in fact it. So thank you guys for watching. Thanks for keeping up with the series if you have been. This is obviously second week of successful updates, so we're getting back into the swing of things. Very excited to be back on track with this project. And hopefully we're not much longer before the game is complete and ready to ship. Next up, what are we doing next? Next up would be plugging in the combat, the randomly generated combat, just traveling around and getting random encounters. Also implementing the general encounters for unexplored ports. So that was, again, the houses. So getting those implemented so that when you step on a house, it generates, and then also goes into a list so that it can be degenerated. Again, when you enter in an unexplored port, then it becomes an explored port, and you can stop there for resources. So we need to implement that. And then that may be, between those things, that may be everything we do next session, session 38. That may be enough content for that. After that, however, we need to go ahead and actually implement planets and stations into this version of the game. Again, that is probably going to be 90% copy paste out of the demo. However, there are probably going to be unanticipated things that I'm going to have to work around, but that is the plan. So plan is session 38, get random combat and the house encounters in, and session 39 would be stations and planets. So that's the plan moving forward. Again, I kind of said this earlier, kind of jumped the gun a little bit, but thank you guys for watching if you have been, and I hope you have a great and wonderful day, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're at in the world, and I will catch you next time.